Hey, college students. The future of our democracy urgently depends on us. You can help on-air student leaders curate trusted information on governance and elections and provide an online town square where we can all talk with politicians and each other to find common ground on issues and legislation on us.onair.cc. Our sponsors tonight are Democracy on Air, a nonpartisan nonprofit that supports the U.S. On Air network of 50 governance and election hubs, and GMU Students on Air, which oversees the GMU On Air chapter and the U.S. On Air network.
Good afternoon. My name is Frida Cervantes, and I will be your host for today's Aircast with Delegate Elizabeth Bennett-Parker. To start off our Aircast, we produced a 1-minute video on Delegate Bennett-Parker's biography and policy positions on issues based on her campaign website. Students on Air at GMU introduce Elizabeth Bennett-Parker. Elizabeth Bennett-Parker is the Democratic delegate for Virginia's 45th House District. Bennett-Parker was born in Alexandria. A former Fulbright Fellow, she completed her education at Cornell and the University of London. She has also served her hometown in a number of ways, most notably as vice mayor. Her entrepreneurial side can be seen in Fruit Cycle, an enterprise she founded to fight against food waste. Bennett-Parker continues to live in Alexandria. Elizabeth Bennett-Parker's policy positions include codifying women's right to abortion in the Virginian Constitution, making sure education systems can foster children's growth, providing paid leave to all workers, and reforming Virginia's justice system, modernizing Virginia's public transit options, and having Virginia play its part in the fight against climate change. Bennett-Parker says, "I will always strive to ensure that our Commonwealth is an equitable and inclusive place for all." Go to va.onair.cc to learn more about Elizabeth Bennett-Parker. Go to us.onair.cc to sign up to talk with your candidates and to learn more about the most competitive congressional and governor races and to get the latest information on U.S. politics and governance. Welcome, Delegate Bennett-Parker. How are you doing today?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
Doing well. Thanks so much for asking. I just wanted to thank you so much for joining us. And to start off our Aircast, we want to ask a question about democracy. One of our missions for our organization is the general promotion of democracy, particularly with college-age voters, but as well as the general public. So the first thing that we want to ask is, how do you think the public can become more engaged and impact our democracy?
Definitely. Thanks so much for having me and for that great question. So I think probably one of the most important things is to exercise your right to vote. Obviously, we have midterm elections coming up in just a few weeks, and today is actually the deadline to update your register to vote if you're not already, or to update your address so that you can still vote in Virginia on a regular ballot. Thanks to some recent legislation passed by the General Assembly, we do now have same-day voter registration, but anyone who sort of registers after today would have a provisional ballot on November 8th. But I think that's incredibly important. I was actually watching your Aircast with Congressman Beyer a few weeks ago, and I know he mentioned sort of they had done some data analysis on his congressional district and sort of the age demographics of primary voters. And obviously we know last year, well, sorry, I've already lost track of what year it is. It's 2022, I guess. Obviously, we know that there's a lot of always engagement during, sort of presidential years and gubernatorial years, but lower turnout in midterm elections. So this is certainly an important election for our country with a lot of things at stake. And so I think that's the first way. And then another way, and I think if you're watching this, you're engaged and informed, that's great. But I would say there's a number of ways to get involved in your community, in local government even, or at the state level. We have a lot of volunteer boards and commissions in every jurisdiction in Northern Virginia, as well as at the state level. So there's, local commissions for women, or commissions, environmental policy commissions, things like that. And then we also have similar things at the state level. So that's something that as residents, you're able to apply, and a way to make sure your voice is heard in all levels of decision making as well.
Thank you so much for your response. I definitely agree that local impacts are great, and local offices as well. And our next question is kind of pertains to your priorities, your education priorities. Per your campaign website, it says equity-focused K-12 education is one of your priorities. So how would you help schools recruit and retain highly qualified teachers?
Sure, definitely. So I think there's a lot of needs when it comes to education in Virginia. And I think that starts, like you said, in many cases with teachers, and teacher pay in Virginia is not where it needs to be. I'm trying to remember the exact statistic, but basically based on sort of the average pay of our state, sort of what all workers make, and compared to the rest of the US, our salaries are much lower than other states. And so that's certainly important, but it's also things like it's not just salary and benefits, it's also sort of working conditions. And I think we've seen a lot of efforts to take autonomy away from teachers over sort of what they're allowed to teach and how they're allowed to teach it, as well as recent policies like the governor's proposed policy on transgender students that would actually sort of require teachers to out their students, perhaps. And I think, at least in my district, that's something that our school systems are not supportive of, that are having just effects on teachers because we're asking teachers to do too much. And sort of similar, supporting our educational system with additional resources, additional support staff and counselors and mental health therapists, because again, right now we're just placing so much on teachers that it's leading to, sort of teacher retention problems and folks burning out. But I think also there's been some good work in pilot programs, and certainly we can do more to cover sort of the licensing costs and things like that to actually become a teacher. And so that can certainly help folks get in the profession as well.
Thank you so much for your response. And now we're going to open up the floor for our student panelists. Our first student panelist is Joe Kubicki. He is a government and international politics major. Joe, the floor is yours.
Hi, Delegate. Thank you for being here today. I actually wanted to continue on the topic of education, and so on your priorities page, it does you talk about equity-based education, and I was curious if that had anything to do with how we fund education, because right now, it's done through property taxes, which in areas like mine in Stafford, I went to Colonial Forge High School, that was no problem because it was property taxes for very expensive houses. But in, very rural districts or just poorer areas, those schools just inherently get less money right now. So what might you do to help those districts too?
Absolutely. So I definitely think we need to address the way that we fund education in Virginia. So right now, as you mentioned, it's based on property taxes. So there's something called the local composite index, which sort of funds how much each school division gets. And that's based on a few different factors. But yes, like you said, sort of the estimated value of property. So it doesn't even take into account if you have a lot of tax exempt properties in your jurisdiction, for example. So if you have a lot of church buildings or a lot of nonprofits, their value of those properties is built into the formula, but not the fact that the local jurisdiction is not actually getting tax revenue for those. And it doesn't actually take into account the actual cost of educating students. And we know that can be higher when you have, English learners of other language, ELL students, students with disabilities, students who are receiving free and reduced meals. So there has been an at-risk add-on to help compensate for some of that in some school divisions. And the budget this year did sort of increase that percentage, but it didn't. The ultimate budget that passed was sort of a compromise. The previous governor's introduced budget and the Senate budget raised that percentage higher than the ultimate budget that passed. And I think it's just over the next 2 years. Of course, it's not really a long-term fix. And again, doesn't take into account sort of adjusting that away from property taxes or things like that. So I certainly think we could do a better job of how we equitably fund education in the Commonwealth, because that is an issue that affects a lot of jurisdictions, not just, it sounds like yours and mine.
Thank you very much.
Our next student is Devin Pieczynski, who is a global affairs major. Devin, the floor is yours.
Hello, Delegate. Thank you for joining us today. I have another question based off the priorities from your website related to housing. With strong zoning laws in Virginia, how do you plan to build affordable housing in places like Arlington? And what kind of housing would you propose to build?
So I think coming from the local level of government first, I'm very passionate about working with localities and at the state level to sort of empower localities to have additional tools in their toolbox. So I know when I was a member of city council, we frequently heard, we would have new projects come before us and we were not legally sort of able to ask for additional contributions for the number of units or the amount of money that was getting donated to the Housing Trust Fund, for example, the way that other states and the District of Columbia are able to do. And so I actually had a bill that I introduced this past year that would have allowed jurisdictions with accessory unit policies already in place to actually require affordable housing contributions on all projects, because the other issue is sometimes when projects are coming before local governments, they, like in Alexandria, for example, we will get that trust on contribution or units on site, as even though it's voluntary, that's sort of built into the proposal. But that's only when a project is coming with sort of asking for zoning permissions or a special use permit. If you have a lot and you are building by right, which means you're building what's allowed on that according to that zone, you don't have to go before the governing body at all. You just build, and so the governing body gets nothing. And so that also would have allowed for local governing bodies to ask for contributions on by right projects as well, which I think would have just been a helpful tool in the toolbox. Unfortunately, that did not pass, although it was sent to the Housing Commission for a letter, which I need to follow up on because I have not seen that letter yet for sort of what tools we can look at. But I do think at the state level, again, we need additional housing investment in the Housing Trust Fund because that's been used to spur projects in localities like ours. But again, this is not, we also need more partnership at the federal level, to be honest, as well. This is not something that either local levels of government or the state government are going to be able to solve by ourselves because we have to balance our budgets, among other things. So we need additional partnership at the federal level. But I think at the state level, again, while I think this budget added 120 or 180 million, somewhere in that range to the Housing Trust Fund. Again, it was not at the level that the previous governor's introduced budget had or the Senate budget had. What we got in the final budget was a little bit lower, but again, certainly better than nothing and better than what we had before, but just an area for continued investment and continued work.
Thank you for your response. And our next student panelist is Samuel Fuelleman, a political science major. Sam, the floor is yours.
Hi, welcome for coming. My question is relating to another issue or priority on your website around the climate crisis, and you go over several things you want to do. But what would you say is your top priority when it comes to the climate crisis? Because you're running for a state level position, and will you be hoping to coordinate with like more national groups, more state level groups? What do you see as your top priority when combating the climate crisis?
That's a great question. I think it's continuing our path and trying to accelerate our path towards 100% renewable energy. I think right now in the state of Virginia, and when it comes to climate change, we're unfortunately in a little bit of a defensive position at the moment rather than an offensive position, just with the change in administration and the change in the House of Delegates. We saw when I was in session this year, a lot of attempts to repeal some of the progress that had previously been made, to repeal parts of the Virginia Clean Economy Act, to repeal the Clean Car Standards, to repeal sort of citizen input and the weight and power of air and water boards, to restrict SCC authority, things like that. And of course, efforts to repeal us from RGGI, which is incredibly important in terms of funding for, in my district and others, flooding mitigation projects, for example. So I think certainly look forward to continuing to work on this issue. When I was on city council, took the lead in declaring a climate emergency, took the lead on amending our green building policy to require that our future public buildings in Alexandria be net zero. And similarly, we had taken advantage of some state legislation called CPACE to help make sure that existing buildings are more easily able to access financing to retrofit them because it's not just making sure that new buildings are up to par and built to that, but also there's a lot of emissions that come from existing buildings that are sort of lower efficiency. So looking forward to continuing that work, but right now we're in a bit of a defensive position.
Okay, thank you for answering. That was a good answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
And our last final student is going to be Ben Murphy, a political science major. Ben, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you for joining us today, Delegate. I actually have two questions. The first one's going to be about education. You mentioned investing in teacher training, and I was wondering if you could kind of expand on what that exactly entails.
Sure. So I think sort of coming back to the previous question, we want to make sure that folks have the ability to access teacher licensing programs and training at low cost to themselves so that they can access this profession given the shortage that we have, but also sort of continuing teacher training to make sure that folks are up to latest evidence-based research, for example, around literacy, which is something that we did earlier this year with the Virginia Literacy Act to sort of expand and improve upon the way we teach literacy in Virginia and providing different levels. So in the school system, providing additional resources to teachers and parents, but also like going back to those teacher training programs and making sure that they're equipped to teach, again, evidence-based literacy practices. So that would be an example.
Okay, great. Thank you. And on my second question, it's about the paid leave portion of your website. I'm curious if you could kind of talk a little bit about how you think we achieve the goal of getting every worker, paid family leave. Like what are the steps that we start taking to accomplish that?
Yeah, definitely. So I think this is critically important because even though we have the federal act, it's, guarantees unpaid leave, and even about 55% of Virginia workers are not even eligible to take that unpaid leave, and no one should be forced to choose between their health or that of their family and their paycheck. I think this has become even more evident and clear through the pandemic. You certainly don't want sick people working in nursing homes or working in food service, infecting other people, no matter what, if they have a cold or the flu, that's just not good for anyone. Same thing with teachers. This is just not healthy. And I think how we get there, it's a little bit of a challenge, but certainly other states have proven the way. I think Maryland's recently passed legislation, so it can be done, but it's just going to involve bringing stakeholders together and figuring out the best path forward. And again, hopefully, political pressure from constituents as well, and people standing up and saying this is something we believe and this is something we want and this is something we need as a community, and holding their elected officials accountable as well.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much to our student panelists for your participation today. Do you have any final thoughts?
Sorry, me?
Sorry about that. For the student panelists.
I had one last question that I thought of. The Virginia government is going to be divided, at least between Democrats and Republicans, for as long as Governor Youngkin is governor. So I was curious, just what do you think are like realistic policy goals while he's in office?
Definitely. Thank you for that question. And so I will say, of course, that next year is an incredibly important election year in Virginia because the entire House of Delegates and the entire state Senate will be up for election. So again, please exercise your right to vote in that election. So right now, as you mentioned, we'll have a divided government presumably. And so right now the House of Delegates has a 52-48 Republican Democratic split. The Senate has a 21-19 Democratic Republican split. And then we have the governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general who are all Republican. So I think despite the sort of increasing partisanship that we see at sort of all levels of government, it's important to note that Virginia, we still got good things done this year. So we had 2,250 bills introduced in the General Assembly, and about 40% of those were signed into law. We talked about some of them, the Virginia Literacy Act. Again, we talked about some good things in the budget. Obviously, would have liked to see some higher levels of investment in certain areas of the budget, but overall, the budget had historic levels of investment in education, in some other human services areas. There were some really great things in there. So I do think we are able to still work together in the Commonwealth and get things done. But like you said, it sort of depends on the issue and depends on the policy. And so it's where you can find common ground. And issues that maybe are not always super partisan. I would say that's not a very specific answer, but I think, there's some very niche things where we can still work together. And then again, we're just still getting some good things passed. So.
Thank you.
Do any other students have any final thoughts?
Just thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And yes, so thank you so much, Delegate Bennett-Parker, for your participation. Do you have any final thoughts regarding this Aircast?
No, I just thank you all for your time and for your work and making sure that you're interviewing folks in government and making sure that students are informed and educated. And thank you.
Yes, of course. It was a pleasure having you featured in our Aircast. And that looks like all the time that we have for this afternoon's Aircast. So thank you.
Thank you. Have a good one.
You can learn more about the US On Air network by going to us.onair.cc and select one of the About posts. You can find a video recording of this Aircast in our US and Virginia On Air YouTube channels and in VA On Air posts.